my name is Jill Shinlever. I teach biology at Career Magnet Academy. The handout that accompanies this video can be found on the KCS website under the Student Resources tab. This is Activity 3 for Biology. Today we're going to learn about biodiversity and population ecology. After today's lesson, you should be able to apply what you've learned about biodiversity to a real-world example. In addition, we will examine a representative ecosystem and, based on data, predict what happens to populations in that ecosystem. If this video is hard to understand, you may turn on the closed captions, adjust the playback speed to slow down the video, consider watching short clips, then pause, listen, and watch again. Ask someone in your home to watch the video with you. Stop frequently and talk to your partner about what you heard and understood. Let's start with the article from National Geographic. If you've not had a chance to read it, pause the video now and please do so. You will find the link at the top of the student handout under Part A. Also, complete the items on the handout under Part A. Biodiversity. That's a word that you hear on occasion. Maybe when you're reading about an environmental issue, maybe while you're watching a Netflix docuseries, maybe it's while you're visiting a park. But you may not have considered the depth of this word and the fact that there are multiple types of biodiversity. Biodiversity itself is defined as all different kinds of living organisms within a given area. Looking at the article, we see mentioned 3 types of biodiversity. Species diversity, the first one, is the abundance of different species living in an area. This is usually what we think of when we think about biodiversity. A good example is the Great Smoky Mountains ecosystem. Did you know that the Great Smoky Mountains National Park is home to over 20,000 different species? We say it's rich in species diversity. Another type of biodiversity referenced in the article is ecosystem diversity. Ecosystem diversity is the variety of ecosystems in an area, usually a large area. The example given in the article is the continent of Africa. When you think of Africa, you might think of the grasslands of the Serengeti. But there's also tropical rainforest, desert. You might even think about the United States and the diversity of ecosystems we have across our country. Or, if you think about driving across the state of Tennessee, from East Tennessee to West Tennessee, you go from a very forested ecosystem to a more grassland-like ecosystem in West Tennessee. Our planet is diverse, and we benefit from all of the ecosystems, as we'll discuss in just a moment. The third type of biodiversity listed in the article is genetic diversity. Genetic diversity is defined as the diversity of genes within individuals of the same populations. Take, for instance, a population of black bears in East Tennessee. A genetically diverse population would have lots of variety in the alleles in the gene pool. Think about what you learned in Lesson 2. If you've not watched the Lesson 2 video, make sure and go back and do that. Genetic diversity is important. For our bear population, we want high genetic diversity in the genes that make the black bears different from other black bears. The next item on the handout asks you to list the ecosystem services mentioned in the article. I have a list. Let's look at it together. Oh, the first one that comes up is oxygen supply. So certainly our ecosystems aid in that. You learned about that when you learned about photosynthesis and energy transfer. Also, of course, we could talk about carbon dioxide here. Food is supplied by our ecosystems. shade. That's interesting. Usually when we think about shade, especially in summer, we think about when we go outside and we don't want to sit in the heat. So shade is nice. And definitely it's okay to think about that service it provides to us, but also think about shade as it provides a service to aquatic species. Think about a river that is exposed and there's no tree cover compared to a stream where there is tree cover, right? Where there is tree cover, the aquatic species are a little more protected from the heat of the sun as it heats up the water. Construction materials, our homes, our buildings, our schools, all built out of materials that were at one time part of an ecosystem. Fiber for clothing and paper, prevention of flooding. Right? Our ground definitely absorbs water, but also the roots of trees and plants is there to keep then the soil from eroding. Soil fertility in agriculture, again, for growing and supporting our food needs. Clean water, right? We like clean water for recreation, but certainly also for drinking and providing to our plants and animals. Medicines, household medicines, just like aspirin, come from plant sources, as well as many of the cancer drugs that we use to date go back to research done on plants. Tourism, that's certainly a big one for us in East Tennessee. We know in this area we draw a lot of tourists to see the national park, but also just to experience recreation on our lakes and our rivers. So that is a big deal for us here in East Tennessee as a service that our ecosystems provide. I think we can all agree that protecting ecosystems is critical. For an ecosystem to continue to supply those important ecosystem services, the ecosystem must remain stable and healthy. If we remove a species from the ecosystem or from the food web, as you see pictured, maybe because of disease, habitat destruction, overharvesting, that ecosystem may not be able to recover unless there is another species available to fill the niche of the one that is on the decline. So yes, biodiversity does promote ecosystem stability. So let's consider the coral reef ecosystem. The coral reef ecosystem is a unique marine ecosystem that certainly adds to the ecosystem diversity of our planet, as well as the marine environment. A healthy reef ecosystem consists of communities of corals, sponges, anemone, clams, shrimp, fish, turtles, and many, many more species. Let's consider a decline in one of the species of coral. This decline stands to impact all the other populations that are living in the reef. The ecosystem may remain stable if enough variety of coral species exists to fill in the gaps created by the loss. We can also consider the importance of genetic diversity and adaptations here. Say the coral population that is declining contains individuals with an adaptation that protects them against the threat. This genetic diversity in the population may allow survival for some individuals. Coral bleaching is a threat to the coral reef ecosystem. I encourage you to read and do some research on this issue. You'll hear it mentioned again in Lesson 4. I've included some links about the topic at the end of the handout under the enrichment section. As you've noticed, when we study ecosystems, it's important to consider the interactions between populations. Let's look at one of the longest running predator-prey studies in the world. It is a study of an island ecosystem in Lake Superior, the Great Lakes. On this 45-mile-long island, the interactions between moose and wolves have been studied and documented since the 1950s. As we look at this study, let's notice a few things. First of all, the data is portrayed in a graph where the years are across the x-axis. Notice that we have two scales for the data graphed on the y. The scale on the left is the measure of wolf abundance, while the scale on the right is the measure of moose abundance. So, why two different scales? Pause for just a moment and think about your answer to that question. Two different scales are used because the range in the numbers of individuals is different when comparing the moose to the wolves. This is typical when you consider that moose are herbivores. If we were describing them in an energy pyramid, we would say they are primary consumers. The wolves in this instance are described as secondary consumers. It takes a larger number of primary consumers to support the secondary consumers, just like it takes an even larger number of producers to support the primary consumers. I've placed a link to a video on energy pyramids at the end of the handout. I encourage you to view that video, refresh your memory if you've learned about these terms in ecology before, or pick up on it if you have not. Next, let's consider some key events that are depicted through this graph. Look at part B of the handout. Question 1, I ask you to predict the cause of the wolf die-off that occurred in 1980. That's here. Then in question 2, I ask you to predict what might have caused the moose die-off that occurred around 1996 here. So, what did you predict? Maybe it was one of these population limiting factors. Food, water, and shelter. Those are always the big three that we think about first when we think about populations that are kept in check so that they are not growing exponentially. Their growth shows more of a logistical trend like you're seeing here with both of these populations, usually under a carrying capacity. So those are the big three. Here's some others though. Competition, certainly, with those within their population, but also other species living within the same ecosystem. Disease has the potential to cause a decline of numbers in a population. Natural disasters, even weather extremes, maybe parasites. Predation pressure, much as the wolves are applying predation pressure to the moose. But what about biodiversity? Could we consider it a limiting factor? All right, let's talk again about two of the types we mentioned earlier. Species biodiversity. Remember how species biodiversity supported the food web. So if there is low species biodiversity, is there potential for there to be decline in a population or for a population to be kept in check below the carrying capacity because of that low biodiversity? What about genetic biodiversity? Genetic biodiversity supports viable reproduction and a rich diversity in the genetics of the population. So if there's low genetic biodiversity, is there potential there for that to be a limiting factor? Now, take a moment if you have not, and pause the video and read the article titled, Moose Wolves Cling to Our Royal. Then complete questions 3 and 4 on the handout. So, what did you find out? The author states that the major wolf die-off in 1980 was caused by a virus. It was caused by a virus that was brought to the island by a domesticated dog, probably someone hiking with their pet, and they did not know that their animal had the parvovirus. So it carried it to the wolf population. The population density was very high at this point, of course, and so it was more easily spread across the population. Next, the moose. So in 1996, the moose went through a major die-off due to a few factors. Let's see if any of them are what you came up with from the article. One of them was a very harsh winter. So it was very cold. Maybe the winter was long, but it was more extreme than usual. That was certainly a factor and a big factor, but another one was the fact that the moose had been suffering from an increased tick population. So in the fall and the summer before, because of these ticks irritating their skin, they did scratch off a lot of their fur and spots. So take that, go into the winter when it's extremely cold, and so some of the moose did not survive. They didn't have that healthy adaptation of theirs of thick fur and did not survive the winter. Also, it's thought that the balsam fir even had a difficult time that winter. And so, of course, that's their favorite food species. Now, for the rest of the story. As you can see, the moose population recovered just fine. However, the wolves have yet to get close to their original peak. You might be asking, why is that? What's going on currently with the wolves? I hope that you'll take a few moments to look over the study, the most recent study published by the scientists that study eye royal. They write a report every 2 years, and it is published and easy to get to. The link is at the bottom of the handout. In recent years, there's been some controversy and discussion on how to best protect and support the populations on the island. Should humans intervene and help the wolves? Should humans leave nature alone? You will find out that in recent years, the wolves have suffered because of low genetic biodiversity. Remember that topic from earlier in this lesson? Here it is mentioned as a critical factor of this famous real-world wildlife population study. This is the end of Lesson 3. I hope you've learned something new. I hope that you're interested enough to explore the enrichment topics at the end of the lesson. Please participate in the 4th and final lesson for biology. I hope you have a great summer.